Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to go over what you should include in your CV and your personal statement, which are basically the main application materials that will get you to the stage of an interview for genetic counseling programs, because initially when you submit your application, these are the main two documents that will be included with most of the applications. So really getting your foot in the door with a program is going to come from the way you develop these two documents. And so this is essentially what the school is going to go off of, in addition to your letters of recommendation, when they're looking at your profile and trying to narrow down from all the applicants who they want to actually interview. And then in the interview, you can elaborate on some of these things, but this is really what's going to help you stand out and what's going to help you establish the first interest with the program to invite you for an interview. So I'm not going to include my exact language of the CV and the personal statement, but I'm going to demonstrate everything that I've included in here and the things that are important to have, at least from what I was told, what I found through my research, and what was successful for me in matching with a program this cycle. So for my CV, it's pretty simple in terms of the layout. It's nothing too fancy. For genetic counseling, it is a pretty unique program. And especially with the way that genetic counseling is unique and that shadowing is hard to come by, and that there's a lot of different diverse backgrounds that come into genetic counseling. From what I found, there was no real required size or different criteria to include. It's kind of flexible, which is actually a good thing, because then you can add what you want and you can really try to make yourself stand out in a number of ways in terms of the CV, at least. So what I mean by that is there's no size requirement that I can remember. So I basically added as much as I thought was appropriate. And where that really comes into play is I'll go over the different categories I have here. I start off with my name, obviously, my NMS match ID number, which is critical to have at the top of your CV so they can have you as that number in their profile, because if they do end up ranking you, they need to have that number. So that's really important. Then I have education, genetic counseling exposure, which this is what I was just talking about. This is a very unique thing to have on a CV. It doesn't fall under work experience or leadership or volunteering or education. It's just genetic counseling exposure. And what I did for this is I basically put every substantive genetic counseling exposure that I had and just listed it here and what I gained from it. So that I'll get into depth in that in a second, but that's a unique thing that I wouldn't see on any other kind of CV as far as I'm concerned. Then I have work experience, research, volunteer work, leadership, honors and awards, and additional interests. So those are the categories I chose to include. The order I don't think is too important, but I kind of just went by relevance, at least as I perceived it. And so then education, it was a very small section. I just had University of Pittsburgh, my major and my GPA essentially. For genetic counseling exposure, this is probably the most relevant part for this video, like the most novel idea that I'm going to share. And so this is something that, if it's not explicitly laid out in any of the program application guidelines that you might see on their websites, this is something you should definitely include, because essentially when you are applying to these programs, they just want to see, they need to understand from your application that you fully understand what genetic counseling is. Because the cohorts are so small for genetic counseling, they really can't afford to be giving interviews and certainly admission, like as a match, to people that don't fully understand, because having anyone drop out of the program, as far as I understand, it's pretty much unheard of, because they really vet their applicants to make sure they are completely set on being a genetic counselor. Because with a cohort of 10 or 12 people, you really can't afford to be giving those spots to someone that is not 100% set on being a genetic counselor. So this is where you can make that very clear. Your personal statement will also accomplish this, but we'll get into that in a couple minutes. So genetic counseling exposure. Some of the things I have, obviously the YouTube channel, Journey to GC, that was a major thing that I did that helped me get exposed to genetic counselors through the informational interviews I shared. So I shared that. I put the link right on the CV so that some of the programs were able to watch that if they had the time to do that. And then I just put a couple bullet points of what I gained from this. Then there was a pre-genetic counselor experiential practicum I did through Columbia University. This was a remote experience that I did in the fall this past year. It was a really great experience. It was a good way to kind of shadow genetic counselors. If you can, I'll see if I can find a way to apply to this. You did have to apply, and it was a great experience though. So if they're doing it again, I definitely will try to provide that application link, because it was a great experience and a lot of programs were interested about it when I did have my interviews. So I will follow up on that for you guys. There's the Genetic Counseling Career Fair that's done through the Western States Regional Genetics Network. This is something I did the past 2 years, and it was really helpful just because you can go on this career fair. Every single program has a Zoom link, and there's just a layout of the United States with different regions, and you click on a region and it shows every school in that region, and then every school is a link to go to a Zoom where there's students and program leadership from all those programs, and you can just ask them questions. You can hear them give a little presentation about their program. And this is the most helpful way I ever had of learning about genetic counseling programs, because you can go on your own on the websites, and you should and you will, but this is the first way to meet with program leadership. And it's pretty cool because then at the interviews that I ended up attending, I recognized these people that I had seen 2 years prior in a webinar and an informational session about their program. And then there I was interviewing with them for actual admittance into the program. It's a pretty cool full circle, and it's just an invaluable way to learn about the program. So absolutely, I'll try to find when that's happening. I think they do it every year. The next thing I have is a guide to genetic counseling, the genetic counseling textbook. This is something that I never read the entire thing front to back, but there's a lot of things that I specifically read that I was interested in. For instance, the history of genetic counseling was something very interesting. I made a video about that. Different techniques and principles about the profession. And something that I especially found helpful and I used as preparation for my interviews, which will be a much later video that I can go in depth when interview season's rolling around, was the ethical components of genetic counseling. So I read up on that a lot before my interviews, because there are questions you'll be asked about some ethics. They don't expect you to know everything, and the best way to go through a genetic counseling session before you're a genetic counselor, but this is something that was really helpful for my preparation for interviews as well. Then there was a genetic counseling case series that conveniently is offered by the University of Cincinnati. So I didn't know I would end up matching there, but there are several online courses you can buy from the University of Cincinnati. So I believe this was $99, somewhere around there. And this is a course. They have some courses that are, you can actually get like credit for a college, or just to demonstrate the grade you received for that course. But the case series is just a compilation of different presentations by genetic counselors where they explain an interesting case they had. And this was a good way for me to get some exposure, kind of to supplement the lack of shadowing that was available during the era that I was applying for genetic counseling schools. So in addition to informational interviews, a genetic counseling case series is something that I did, which was purchased through the University of Cincinnati online, and at your own pace, you can just watch these different lectures by genetic counselors and learn a lot of cool things about the field. Then there's a podcast I listen to quite frequently called DNA Today. This is on Spotify and any other podcast platforms, but there are a lot of really interesting episodes. There's almost 200 episodes now, I think. So obviously you don't have to listen to all of them, but there's a couple that are specifically for genetic counseling, which obviously is very relevant. But then there are some that are just about genetics in general and some interesting implications of where the field is heading. So that's another thing I put. Then the Genetic Counseling Club for my university, which I was involved in, I mentioned that and what I gained from that. And then there was one shadowing experience I was able to have at a real hospital in person before COVID and the pandemic. So I put that on there as well, of course. The next thing I had is work experience. So this is something that I spoke with a genetic counselor about when I was preparing my applications. I wasn't sure how much experience is relevant, because you do want to show the discretion you have to recognize what is relevant or not. That I think demonstrates some of your mindset and some of your capacity to be mature about your application and understand what is important to include and what programs might not really care about. But anything relevant I included, such as being a teaching assistant and a virtual tutor, because genetic counseling is something that when you're with a patient in a session, you're going to be explaining the principles of molecular biology to them. And that's something I love about the profession, is that there is an educational aspect to it. And so I thought that it'd be really important to emphasize the educational experiences I had, which would help me be a successful genetic counselor in that aspect. And I did end up adding, I forget exactly why I was so reluctant to add this, but I put on my work experience that I was a barista for a number of years. I think the reason I felt this was relevant, just to show that I was a contributing member of society. I had a job I worked in for a number of years in a row. I maintained employment at this company over a long period of time, which shows some commitment and some longevity in my pursuits. And additionally, this is something where I was working with people on a daily basis and working in resolving conflicts and being a team player, things like that. So if you can emphasize aspects of any experience on your CV that you think would be relevant to genetic counseling or graduate school in some capacity, then I think that is the threshold which would make it appropriate to include. And this is one of the things I struggle the most with adding, and no one really asked me about it in interviews. It was never that important after I put it on here, but I decided to add it, and I guess it worked out all right. So the next category I have is research. So there's a couple of research experiences I had through my STEM experience. One thing is the Igem research fellowship I did last summer. The Igem research was the International Genetically Engineered Machine. That's something that a lot of different schools have. It's a team of, it's led by students with faculty mentorship to kind of guide your program. So I emphasized how that was good for teamwork and having some independence in creating a project. I also worked in an undergraduate research lab in the biology department at Pitt for about a year and a half. And then I also worked as a student researcher back in high school, but that was the first experience I had with genetics and genetic engineering and wet lab at all. So I thought that was pretty important to include. That was like a self-guided research project for a class I had, and I was working to engineer bacteria and then also infect that into plants using the bacteria as like a vector for gene expression, and that was a pretty cool project. The other thing with all the research I had where there was a relevant principal investigator, I added that as well. If you are including research, I think that's important because that shows some credibility and potentially a reference if anyone's interested. I will note though, I was never asked about any wet lab research in my interviews, but I did end up talking about it in the sense of like teamwork, conflict resolution, and cooperativity with the fellowship I had last year that I mentioned was student run. There were a lot of questions about working with people when things went wrong, how you resolved conflict, how you problem solve, and a lot of lessons that I learned in that arena came from that research. So while I was never explicitly asked about research, it did come up by my own discretion of mentioning it, if that makes sense. Because I know that not everyone has research experience because it's not overly relevant to genetic counseling where you have to have worked in a lab. It's not even required by a lot of programs, but that's the capacity in which it was included in my experience. The next section I have is volunteer work. So the major thing for this section was crisis counseling. That's super important. I added the amount of hours that I had completed to date, and at the time that I applied, it looks like it was 88 hours. I then ended up having well into the hundreds. They're between 100 and 200. I tried to get as many as I could before sending the application so that it would show I clearly had passed a threshold of experience where I would have gained a lot from the crisis counseling. I also included some mission trips that I did in high school. Those actually did come up in some interviews. So definitely anything you put on your CV, you want to be able to elaborate on and have a very distinct relevance to how you think it contributes to your preparation for genetic counseling, because anything is fair game to be interviewed upon. The next thing I have is leadership. I held several leadership positions in my fraternity in college, and so those are, again, a lot of, it never came up per se, but a lot of the questions lend themselves to discuss a time when you had leadership initiatives, where you had conflict resolution and teamwork and problem solving. So this is something where, again, I learned a lot of lessons about teamwork. I worked on a 12-person executive board, so there was a lot of different disagreements or problems we had to solve together and work with a diverse group of people. So that's the capacity in which that came up in interviews. I then had honors and awards. And so there's a couple awards. Like, I had an award for the secretary position I held on my executive board that I just mentioned. So I put that, which kind of shows more credibility in the leadership I just described. There's a couple awards from Pitt and a scholarship or two that I earned as well, which just further shows some accomplishments and accolades. And then I put some additional interests, which I just threw in to kind of round myself out. So that just includes like foreign language that I learned and some, recreational interests, just to show that there's some more dimension to you than being obsessed with genetic counseling. So that's my CV. The most important part of that is probably the genetic counseling exposure. You obviously, that's the most like novel part of it, as I mentioned, that you would not include in any other CV that you've made before for other jobs. And basically you want to be throwing in as much as you can about, as long as it's relevant. Like, there are some things where, for a lot of different programs, I would go to their webinars. Like, every program I applied to, and some that I didn't end up even applying to, they would have these webinars, and I got on their email list at some point, or their website mentioned it, and I would go to them and they would talk about their program. There would be some students there to share information, and those are great, but those seemed like a little bit too minor and not insignificant, but I didn't think it warranted a spot on an official CV, because there would just be too many of them as well, unless you included something that just said, various program webinars to learn more about the programs. If you need to supplement your CV in this section particularly, then maybe that would be appropriate, but that's something I chose to leave out personally. But the major experiences I did include. So like for the YouTube channel, I included all the names of the people I interviewed, for instance. But yeah, for every single experience in any category, I put what that was. I put the dates, the range of time, the window of time that I experienced that, and then I just put some bullet points ranging from 1 to about 3 bullet points of what I gained from that experience. All right, so for the personal statement, there is a lot more flexibility and not as many things necessarily required. Now, I used the same personal statement for every program I applied to, and I think that might not always work. You need to check on the actual program website for their application materials, like what they require, but for most of the programs, I think the requirements overlap. And so essentially all you're doing is explaining why you're interested in genetic counseling and how you're prepared to take on that role as a genetic counseling student and enter into that field. So the personal statement is a really good way to make yourself stand out if you can. What I chose to employ is like some pretty creative writing right off the start, which I guess could seem out of place, or I guess just a little unexpected for a personal statement that's explaining why you want to go to this program. But from the feedback I had is that this helped me stand out. So I think that's definitely a good strategy. So there's a couple points that are important to make. I'm not going to share the entire thing verbatim, but in terms of general strategies and general things to consider, first, there's a very cliche notion in genetic counseling that people who are genetic counselors love science and they love people, so they combine those two into being a genetic counselor. That's something you need to avoid at all costs. That's like a very common point of wisdom you'll hear, because it is very cliche, and it's true for everyone in genetic counseling, which is great. But like the fact that by virtue of applying, they already know that's true about you, and it's also not a unique thing to say. The next thing is, through your personal statement, you don't want to be reiterating your CV. So like the first draft I had of my personal statement was really bad because I basically was going through my CV, like explaining how each of those experiences crafted or like shaped a different aspect of why I want to be a genetic counselor. And that's very redundant because you already have your CV also submitted to the program. So they obviously already know all that stuff about you, and they know that because you put it on your CV, you think it contributes to your genetic counseling preparation. So you don't need to include that. And I would shy away from that. So in fact, as I look back at this, there's pretty much only one experience from my CV that's mentioned at all. So to backtrack, for general guidelines, I think it depends on the program, but most of them, they definitely want fewer than 2 pages for your CV. Mine is not that long. It's like a page. It's almost 2 pages, but they'll tell you the requirements. You may have to tweak it for different programs, but I was able to use the same one for all of them. So I start off with the creative writing that explains kind of how I became interested in genetics as a child growing up. Then I mentioned some personal history that gave genetics and healthcare a bigger impact in my life that led me to know I want to pursue it in some capacity. And then I guess it's no surprise, the main thing I touched on is the YouTube channel. So I talk about the YouTube channel, and I talk about how I made this YouTube channel as a way to understand genetic counseling more. And then I talked about one of the actual interviews I did with a genetic counselor that's posted to the YouTube channel. So this is, regardless of what else you include, something that I understand to be a very important aspect of your personal statement is that you have some kind of transformative effect that's mentioned, where your notion of genetic counseling, your understanding of genetic counseling was shaped in some way or changed in some way. So in some capacity, you should include a revelation or a experience that changed the way you view genetic counseling, and that maybe improved your understanding of it and your passion for it. So for me, it was one of those interviews where I already had created the YouTube channel. I already knew I wanted to do genetic counseling, but then there was just a quote from the interview that I included where I had a very transformative experience in that conversation where I began to realize something differently in the way that I perceived genetic counseling, and that helps to show some maturity in your perspective and demonstrate that you understand the field truly, even if it's not. In my case, it was something that was actually like an objective understanding that changed a little bit, but as long as you include some experience that transformed the way you view genetic counseling, and that shows your perspective matured and advanced and solidified your passion for it, I think that will communicate the point. And then something else that I was instructed or had some feedback to do was to close out with potentially a role you see yourself in genetic counseling. So for instance, at this time, I obviously want to see all the different specialties in rotation and just let the rotation schedule kind of dictate where I want to pursue in terms of specialty. But to show that you've really given this a lot of thought, it would not hurt to include a potential specialty or a potential pursuit in genetic counseling that you envision yourself. So I mentioned that potentially in a preconception or prenatal specialty, I could see myself working. So that's obviously not a binding decision, and you don't want to seem too overconfident in what you want to pursue, but just showing that you've given thought to potentially where you could see yourself also helps to support that you have given this a lot of thought. As long as you communicate that in some capacity, it should be good. So mainly just when you're writing this, think about ways that you can make yourself stand out. Ways, whether that's your actual experience that's very unique, or if you don't have any experiences that are really unique to you that you think would stand out in the capacity of genetic counseling or your road towards applying to this and becoming interested in it, you can at the very least try to make it kind of creative and interesting in that aspect, which would help supplement your standing out by just being more creative and more interesting than other personal statements potentially. So that's the general advice I'd have for a personal statement. This is a lot more flexible and a lot more personalized, obviously, by nature. So there's not quite as much advice to give as there was for the CV, but that's the gist of it. So if there are additional questions, feel free to drop those in the comments, but that's pretty much the gist of the personal statement and the CV. Those are two things that are going to be really important for your applications. You should spend a lot of your time on as the summer is continuing and as you're gearing up to apply. So that's kind of the main thing. I'll have some more videos coming up about the other application processes. But for now, that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know if there's any questions in the comments, and I'll see you next time.